So we are 8 billion more or less on Earth. We produce energy. Sorry, it will be stupid, but
Okay, you're hitting on something that has a certain delicacy to it. You're saying, how can we assume that it is due to CO2 rather than maybe the sun? I have a problem with that comparison because both of them assume that climate is one number and one number is forcing it. And if you look at the Earth, it has dozens of climate regimes. There's something called the Köppen classification. And you have different regimes all over. They behave differently. They each have different climates. The climates depend, they will change without any change in solar output, without any change in CO2, because you have the ocean circulation, and it's constantly bringing heat up or taking heat down. And the time scales for the ocean are between 4 or 5 years for ENSO or El Nino to 1,000 years for some of the really deep circulations. And so to speak about what causes climate, each of those dozens of regimes often has a different climate regime. You can have, there's an argument that arose. We were discussing it earlier. There was something called the medieval optimum. In Europe, in Greenland, there was a period during 1,000 years ago until perhaps the 13th century or 14th century, when you built the great cathedrals and when the temperature seemed to be warm and you had vineyards in England and so on and so forth. Historically, there seemed to be some evidence it was warm. And so when the global warming issue started politically, one of the things people were being told, can you get rid of the medieval warm period? Because there was no CO2 emissions to drive it. The thing that was crazy about that was you then had people, whenever the government asks you find this, there'll be somebody who finds it. It will be fake. But so they found what was called the hockey stick. And it showed no temperature change or cooling until now. And now you get 1 degree. And so even though that's tiny, it's unprecedented. Let's say that we're correct. Okay, so now you have the fact that Europe and Greenland and Iceland are all much warmer, but the average for the Earth is 0. It means someplace else is cooler for 300 years. And so if you had a situation where Europe and Greenland are warmer for 300 years and the rest of the Earth is colder, isn't that a climate change? Yeah. But the metric we're using gives you 0. That's part of the problem, that we're oversimplifying the metric. We're taking a small change in it, and we're ignoring what's causing, not what's causing it, whether it's CO2 or sun, but how does it relate to these regions? And you can see how it relates when you plot the data that goes into making that curve of global mean temperature change. That has a range of 1 degree. The range of the data is 16 to 20 degrees. When you show the data and show the average looks like nothing. So you throw away the data and you stretch the scale so that 1 degree occupies the whole scale. And then people say, looks big. Hopefully we do better than that.
Next question.
What is the best argument? I use the thermodynamics. So the cold cannot warm the warm. So the inertia of atmosphere is far less than ocean, 265 less massive than the ocean. So when the suns go down or when the cloud came, atmosphere is cold rapidly, and water continue to warm the atmosphere. Is that your best argument? But for me, it's my best argument. What do you think?
No, I don't find that argument altogether compelling. It's partly right. I mean, the time frame, in other words, the atmosphere is coupled to the ocean. And so you can't really get away from the heat capacity of the ocean just by having the atmosphere play by itself. And that led us, there are a number of arguments that you can use that relate to that. One is that if you have a very sensitive climate, then it's saying that you get a big change from a little forcing. That little forcing means that the surface, which has the heat capacity of the ocean, is going to change very slowly. So it's going to take a long time to reach the new equilibrium. Whereas if you have very low sensitivity, it says it takes very little to change the temperature, and then the response time will be quicker. Okay? So long response time is associated with high sensitivity, short response time with low sensitivity. Now, any of these tests have usually come out that the sensitivity is exaggerated. And I would argue that even if the sensitivity is not exaggerated, without polar amplification, you won't notice it much. What is the range of temperature today between morning and evening?
20 degrees?
Can be, but probably during the day it's 10 degrees, and then you might go up to 20, 22, so 12 degrees. But people aren't dying in the street because of this. And we're used to it, and it just, the thought that another half degree is the end of the world, that anyone can accept this, just boggles my mind.
We will be soon 10 billion persons. Would be the principle of precaution suggest that we behave as if we were responsible not responsible, but we would contribute hugely in global warming. It's not the principle of precaution, which is part of the EU legislation.
Precautionary principle is insane. At the very beginning of this, when the major figures in the field objected, the newspapers were saying all scientists agree. And you believe that, and you don't believe the numbers. Now, I work with scientists. I know what they agree with. They don't agree with the disaster scenario. They'll all agree maybe there's some warming. And if you look at it, you see that when a politician is saying that a cataclysmic thing will occur, and the scientists agree, and you look at what the scientists say, they say, yes, we think it might go up 1.5 degrees. Yeah. They don't say it'll be a disaster. Do you know what the IPCC says will happen due to this? Tell me what it says will happen. Will you? What the IPCC concludes is if the warming scenario of most of the models occurs, and I don't think it will, the GDP will increase by the year 2100 by only 197% instead of 200%. Is this worth taking away people's cars? Is this worth inflation? Because I worked on the IPCC. I know what they're saying. I know what they're saying is not what you think.
Okay, next
Maybe as a lawyer, you don't think that.
Another question.
Regardless what scientists say, or what science may prove or not prove, we see a societal problem. The societal problem that there is a certain conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom, true or not, is here. When I talk to any educated person in my environment, they're all convinced. When I see my colleague journalists, anything that happens gets related without source of anything by a TV presenter or by a journalist with climate change. Everything is climate change. When I look at children who go to school, they're all convinced. Whenever you say it's not, they look at you as if you are a moron. Now, I have a number of degrees I'm very proud of, but it's a societal problem. It's not a scientific problem.
No.
Or do you disagree?
Here I mentioned there is a difference in the states, that large parts of the states reject this. In Europe, the conformity is much greater.
Yeah.
And so in the UK, the Conservatives and Labour both want to have net zero. There are groups are fighting this. You know, for instance, in the US, if you insist on heat pumps as somehow being saving energy and cutting emissions, in Boston, you're going to freeze during this winter because the heat pump is just not effective at extreme temperatures. You know, if you replace cars, internal combustion engines with electric, people are beginning to realize that electric cars, first of all, have disadvantages. They take a long time to refill, so to speak. They catch fire. They don't have a big range. But a friend of mine, I think, had the funniest response to it. He has a Tesla, and he has a bumper sticker. And the bumper sticker says, "My car runs on coal."
Yeah.
And unless you think electricity comes from the outlet,
Yes.
it comes from something, and usually it's fossil fuel. But no, I mean, you're asking a serious question. How do you stand up when they say everyone agrees? And I think you have to. I mean, it's just a matter of what I found is in most places, there are a lot of people who disagree. They're afraid to say it. I mean, even at universities, you'll lose your funding if you propose to question this. And so what I would say is it will be very difficult, but whenever you have a situation like that, where there's an enforced agreement promulgated by teaching, I mean, you have a problem with children. Young women don't want to get married, don't want to have children because they're going to be dead in 12 years. This is terrible for society. And unless we figure out a way to stop this, it's only going to get worse. What happens, and again, I don't understand the European situation. In the US, as resistance to this increases, you get more and more frantic claims. So, for example, for many years, let's say for about 15 years of this issue, the UN would speak about the temperature change and so on as being out of the ordinary, being extreme. You know, we haven't seen 1 degree in 1,000 years. And they realized that, at least in the States, this was not getting them much traction. And so it switched to extreme weather. And that was very interesting because the IPCC, through the first 5 assessment reports, couldn't find any relation between extreme weather and climate. And so why were they suddenly saying extreme weather? And the reason was every day, someplace on Earth, there is an extreme weather event. And that extreme weather event can be photographed. And you can show it on television and say, this is what's due to global warming. As opposed to an abstract thing like it's gone up 1/10 of a degree, you now show a place being flooded or whatever. And that has more emotional impact. When the politicians have to go to emotional impact because the facts no longer convince someone, you know that it is not motivated by truth.
Yes, I don't know very much about climate change, but when people say, oh, the temperature is going to rise or something, for me, and I want to ask if this, maybe a correction about my thinking, but they say, oh, the temperature is rising, but for me, the Earth is a living organism like a human being. Our temperature is not the same in the morning as in the evening and things like this. And I'm wondering if this, for me, it's normal that changes happen.
Do you know the name James Lovelock?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Gaia hypothesis, which sounds like what you're talking about. And he's an interesting figure. He's dead.
Est-ce qu'on peut entendre la question parce qu'on n'a pas entendu la question?
Ah pardon. Je me demandais juste si la Terre, comme un être humain, les gens semblent effrayés par une idée de changement de température, mais la température change. La Terre est un organisme vivant, et donc je suppose qu'un changement de température est plutôt un bon signe. Signe de quelque chose de normal puisqu'il y a une variation. Comme toute chose vivante.
Okay.
James Lovelock.
Yeah. No, he was saying that the Earth system is a dynamic living system that accommodates things. And initially, he bought into global warming. And then the last 5 to 10 years of his life, he was objecting to it very strongly. He realized that this was junk.
Another question? Noel?
Okay. We always say that there is CO2 anthropic and there is the CO2, natural CO2. Is there a difference between the two CO2 and what is the part of the CO2 coming from us and the part which is natural?
Yeah, it's a question I'm not expert on. I mean, I've read about it as much as you. You do have, of course, natural sources. You have plants and so on that use it, other things we generated. I mean, after all, in your mouth, it's currently about 40,000 parts per million. So you're a source, living things are a source. It's a little bit like seltzer water. You heat it, it releases the bubbles of CO2. You keep it cold, it holds it in. And the oceans behave that way. So there's constant. There's a big seasonal cycle in CO2. You can see that in the data. On the other hand, there are isotopes of CO2 that are peculiar to burning, and they suggest that indeed emissions do contribute to the increase. And probably, I mean, if you look at it, basically half of what we emit seems to appear in the atmosphere. And that usually means that there is what is called a relaxation time. Our emissions are increasing exponentially with a time scale of about 40, 50 years. And that seems to be the relaxation time, so half gets absorbed. How should I put it? When you look at the impact of CO2, you always do it relative to a doubling of CO2. Think about what that means for a moment. It means the change from 200 to 400 is the same as the change from 400 to 800. Is the same as the change from 800 to 1600. Each added molecule does less. And so at some point, what's the problem? I mean, we've already reached a certain amount. It would go a little bit more. The main thing we observe related to CO2 is increased greenery. There's been about a 14% increase in the green area of the Earth due to CO2 increasing in the Industrial Revolution. That has probably added to the nutrition, the ability to feed another billion people. So the only thing I know of for sure is CO2 is beneficial.
L'enfant, après Jean. Ouais.
Yeah, Professor Linson, I wonder if you might just explain briefly what forcing is. Is I've understood that to be in scientific debate the thing that pushes us over the edge into saying that makes the difference, even if it's only a very small change. It's that small change that makes the difference. Like, why do people say that? And why is it not credible to hold to that if it is?
Well, the so-called word forcing, I guess, has its limitations. All you're saying is, if I double CO2, how should I put it? I'm going to have to go through what the greenhouse effect is. Okay, if you have convection, air moving up and down in clouds and cumulonimbus, you're tempted to think, if you're thinking of the laboratory, if you have convection, it tries to make the temperature uniform. That isn't what happens if you have a gas in a deep system, because the gas is rising and expanding and cooling as it goes. And so when you have air heated below, rising in clouds and convective motions, the temperature decreases with height. And you know that if you climb a mountain, it gets colder with height. If the air were dry, it would be about 9.8 degrees per kilometer. But if you have moisture in the air, that's releasing heat of condensation as it goes. So crudely speaking, reduces it to 6.5 degrees. Okay, that means that the air temperature is decreasing with height. So be it. Now you have radiation trying to get out of the system. Now, one reason you have convection is the absorption by water vapor is so strong that radiation can't leave the surface. It heats the surface, generates the convection. And eventually, when you get high enough, about 5 kilometers, there's sufficiently little water above that water vapor that the radiation can reach space. That's called the emission level, the effective emission, characteristic emission level. That's about 5 kilometers, 6 kilometers. What happens if you add CO2 is you make that higher. And because of the convection, a higher level is colder. And because it's colder, it's not getting rid of the heat that the sun is bringing in. So the whole thing has to warm. And then you get warming at the surface because you push the whole thing over. The equivalence is measured in watts per meter squared, added by, it's about 3.7. And you call that forcing. And that forcing would give you something under a degree. You could speak of the forcing from anything else, and that's a convenient way of speaking of it, but that's what it's describing.
And why, therefore, is that not worrying?
Because it occurs all the time. The greenhouse effect is mostly due to clouds and water vapor. It keeps the Earth from being too cold for most animals. And so all you've done is add a little bit to it and not enough to make much difference.
But you said we had a saturation at 50 p.m. So
No, when it's saturated, it doesn't mean it goes to zero. It means you go from something where it's linear in how much you add to logarithmic. So for CO2, we're now in what's called the logarithmic range. Every doubling does the same. And that began at about 50 parts. That's all I meant.
Jean-Paul.
Yes. I have one question because I don't understand why the people are focused on CO2. Because some former studies of Vostok coal shows that CO2 follows the temperature. The variation of CO2 follows the temperature.
Yeah, during the ice ages it did that.
And they never cause the variation of temperature. Therefore, I don't understand why many people are afraid about the CO2 variation.
So there are two questions mixed into this. It is true for major climate change in the Earth's history, like the ice ages, which repeated themselves every 100,000 years. CO2 followed the temperature, didn't lead it. And so, yes, it's right to say it's not the causal factor. When you come to the tiny changes we're seeing now, it's trickier to determine what comes first, because you have fluctuations and a slight increase of a degree, and you have the steady increase of CO2, and it's hard to tell which is first. There have been some studies that suggest what you're saying is true even for the present, that essentially temperature is leading CO2. You know, with any of these studies, they're reasonably complicated, and I have, for better or for worse, my feeling is the two most dangerous words in the English language are studies show.